Hyperspace travel is one of the most important aspects of life in the Star Wars galaxy. The ability to travel safely between systems is what makes the galaxy smaller so that trade and commerce can take place between radically different cultures. Fans of the Old Republic will know that we shouldn't take this for granted because it took thousands of years to map the galaxy as we know it. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into what happens if the hyperdrive malfunctions. I'll take you through how hyperspace travel works from 6 different perspectives and the many extreme risks involved. First, let's break down how hyperspace travel and hyperdrives actually work. This is something we're so used to in Star Wars that we assume the technology has been around forever. However, this wasn't the case, and there were massive shifts in space travel over the millennia. The Qua, a reptilian species from Dathomir, were among the first recorded long-distance space travelers in almost 40,000 BBY. In the Dawn of the Jedi series, we learn how these Force-sensitive beings use their infinity gates to instantly travel to other parts of the galaxy. Later, the Rakatan Infinite Empire stole their secrets and used their dark side powers to conquer and enslave vast swathes of the galaxy. They especially focused on Force-sensitive beings and worlds to fuel their starships and technology. I've covered all this in previous videos, so I won't go too deep into it now. It's enough to say that the Rakatan Infinite Empire collapsed in 25,200 BBY after a deadly plague nearly exterminated the species and disconnected them from the Force. This was a momentous epoch in galactic history because now other beings had the opportunity to freely travel and explore the galaxy. This has also been adapted into canon. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs, but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. Previously, long-distance space travel depended on the Force, but this had many issues. Firstly, most beings don't have these powers, and secondly, they could be abused and used to subjugate entire worlds. According to canon, Devaronian engineers were amongst the first to develop hyperdrive technology. The second edition of Star Wars Build the Millennium Falcon tells us that they reached Felucia with their dangerous tumble drive propulsion engines as early as 27,000 BBY. However, it was after the fall of the Rakata that the floodgates opened with inventors on Corellia and Duro developing effective hyperdrive technology. They haven't changed much throughout history and feature 2 main components. These consist of a Navi computer and the actual reactor assembly or hyperdrive generator. The Navi computer charts a safe path through hyperspace along charted hyperspace lanes, and also analyzes potential dangers on the way, such as space anomalies. Meanwhile, the reactor generates enough power to perform a jump without overextending the ship's main reactor. There were also different classes of hyperdrives for different types of ships. According to Star Wars Complete Vehicles, capital ships like the Imperial Star Destroyer had Class 2 hyperdrives, while the Millennium Falcon had a ridiculously fast .5 hyperdrive. This may seem obvious, but without a hyperdrive, you can't travel in hyperspace. However, this is slightly more complex than it sounds. Hyperspace is another dimension that can only be reached by traveling faster than the speed of light. If the hyperdrive fails, the first immediate consequence could be that you get lost in hyperspace forever. Let's use an example of an Imperial Star Destroyer traveling through hyperspace. Now, imagine if it suddenly released a TIE fighter while it was still in hyperspace. These starfighters notoriously only have sublight engines, so they would be stranded in hyperspace with no way to escape back to their regular dimension. During the Black Fleet crisis, Imperial officer Sil Saranen crammed the Yevithan Nil Spar into an escape pod and ejected him from the Star Destroyer Intimidator, while in hyperspace. As a result, Spar was unable to return to real space and was basically left to go insane and die. That is not a fun way to go. However, it's a slightly different story if a hyperdrive fails. In canon, it's unlikely that this will cause a ship to remain stranded in hyperspace. Instead, it's almost certainly going to abruptly revert to real space, with potentially devastating consequences, which we'll discuss in more detail later. However, in Legends, there are darker implications that suggest that this is a possible outcome. The Essential Guide to Warfare and the old Han Solo Adventures comic books heavily imply that unfortunate spacefarers could be lost forever in hyperspace. This might be one of the most horrific outcomes of a failed hyperdrive because it's such a prolonged ending. If the travelers can't repair their hyperdrive by themselves, they're essentially doomed. They'll be on their own until the very end, after their supplies run out. That's horrifying to imagine. Getting lost in hyperspace is the stuff of nightmares, but there's another more likely consequence. A failed hyperspace jump could result in being stranded in an unexplored region of the galaxy. If the unlucky spacefarer can't fix their engines, it could take hundreds of years to return to the known galaxy. That's how long it took the Yuuzhan Vong to travel across the unknown regions at sublight speeds in the new Jedi Order series and Legends. The bad news is that most species don't live that long. Also, the Yuuzhan Vong used live ships with organic technology, which gave them this unique ability to endure. Regular hyperdrive ships wouldn't have this capacity. This is also why pilots must use very precise calculations to determine the safest path to their destination. Han Solo told Luke Skywalker in Episode 4, "Traveling through hyperspace ain't like dusting crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we could fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova, and that'd end your trip real quick, wouldn't it?" We'll talk more about our favorite Corellian smuggler later because he broke the rules more than anybody. However, the point about precise calculations is totally correct. This is why spacefarers rarely made blind hyperspace jumps unless the situation was dire. In the novel Outbound Flight, navigator George Cardass and the crew of the Bargain Hunter attempted to escape from the enraged Praga the Hutt. As they came under intense fire, Cardass made the split-second decision to perform an emergency hyperspace jump, dumping the ship in the unknown regions. Captain Dubrak Quinto reacted furiously with some reason because Cardass played with their lives. The jump dropped them into Chiss space, where they encountered a young commander known as Thrawn. Cardass inadvertently had a profound impact on galactic affairs because he taught Thrawn basic and gave him valuable information about the regular galaxy as we know it. However, Cardass was lucky because they could have been lost in the uncharted unknown regions forever with no way to escape. Instead, a relatively friendly civilization picked them up and saved them from a lonely, grim fate. This could have worked out very differently for Cardass and his companions. The unknown regions are extremely dangerous for many reasons. First, there are an unusual number of space anomalies in this mostly uncharted section of the galaxy, so no charted hyperspace lanes run through it. This is consistent in both canon and Legends as we see through the different experiences of spacefarers. The sequel trilogy shows us that Emperor Palpatine secretly charted a route to the ancient Sith world of Exegol. This allowed his Sith and First Order forces to consolidate their strength out of sight of the regular galaxy. However, it took Palpatine years to navigate these hidden routes. It was so unlikely that most of the rest of the galaxy never expected it. Even though the Republic, and especially the Resistance, knew that there was a military buildup occurring, they couldn't have predicted this level of mass production. Going back to the dangers of hyperdrive malfunctions and blind jumps, it could have brought Cardass into contact with an aggressive species. In Outbound Flight, the brutal Vagari used their slaves as living shields around their ships in special pods. This would have been a deeply unpleasant outcome for the crew of the Bargain Hunter. Meanwhile, there are a whole bunch of nasty species in the unknown regions. The Sea Rook infamously invade the regular galaxy in the Legends novel, The Truce at Bakura. The Killik and the Grisk are some other vicious beings you don't want to encounter. If we go back to the Old Republic, the Tales of the Jedi series offers another example. Gav and Jory Daragon performed a blind hyperspace jump in about 5000 BBY and ended up in the Stygian caldera. This was in the middle of the ancient Sith Empire and had galaxy-defining consequences. The Sith Empire had been isolated from the Republic for thousands of years. This confirmed the Republic's existence and gave the Sith a way back to the charted galaxy. The great Sith Lord Naga Sadow manipulated the situation and used it as a justification to launch the Great Hyperspace War with devastating consequences. Of course, this video is primarily focusing on hyperdrive failure, but the same results are entirely possible because the pilot or navigator has no control over where they exit hyperspace. They just have to cross their fingers if they have any, and pray that the locals are friendly. Star Wars history shows that this usually isn't the case. So far, I've focused on what could happen if a ship survives a hyperdrive failure and drops out of hyperspace into a relatively safe section of space. However, this is extremely unlikely, and as much as Han Solo likes to say never quote me the odds, they're really not good. The most likely outcome is that the ship will collide with an asteroid field, crash into a star, or be sucked into a gravitational anomaly like a black hole. None of these options is usually survivable, but the good news is that it's usually over before the pilot even knows what happened. Han pushes it to the extreme in The Force Awakens when he performs a hyperspace skip into the atmosphere. He bypassed Starkiller's base planetary shield by exiting hyperspace right above the surface, barely pulling up before crashing. It's a ridiculous maneuver that is practically impossible. Even the tiniest miscalculation would have turned the Falcon into bantha fodder. That's why hyperdrive failures often result in spaceships quickly transforming into fireballs. Of course, space anomalies can also trigger hyperdrive failures like misjumps or emergency dropouts. The unknown regions are notorious for this because of the sheer number of black holes and shifting gravity fields. It's extremely difficult to chart this area because it's constantly evolving. There's a strong chance of suffering hyperdrive failures just by entering it. This unreliability is the main reason why the Chiss use their Force-sensitive Skywalkers to navigate the unknown regions instead. Meanwhile, the Essential Guide to Warfare explains the significance of using established hyperspace lanes for fleet movements. Ships must avoid massive objects with huge mass shadows or risk being pulled out of hyperspace. This would be a tactical nightmare and is one of the main reasons why mapped hyperspace lanes are so significant. Taking an unconventional route might seem like a clever idea on paper if you wanted to trick an opponent, but in practice it's probably suicidal. Unless of course you're Han Solo, who does it multiple times. In the Clone Wars movie, the Republic negotiated access to hyperspace lanes in Hutt space in return for helping to save Jabba's kidnapped son, Rata. This also had the unforeseen effect of validating the Hutt families as a separate autonomous government entity, but the Republic believed it was worthwhile. During the High Republic era, Lina So shut down hyperspace lanes because in the wake of the Great Disaster, hyperspace itself had become unpredictable, turning every jump into a potential catastrophe. Though not publicly known at first, the Nile used chaotic hyperspace routes, which contributed to hyperspace instability. Suddenly, established hyperspace lanes became unstable and dangerous, with any active lane producing debris strikes. This had a profound effect on the galaxy in the novel Light of the Jedi, with severe impacts on supply chains and destruction on a wide scale. The crisis required Jedi intervention and emergency response fleets. Meanwhile, in Timothy Zahn's brilliant Thrawn trilogy, the legendary Grand Admiral released a cluster of cloaked asteroids above Coruscant, essentially shutting the Republic's capital down. Galactic citizens took the threat of space anomalies and debris like asteroids extremely seriously because of the devastation they could cause. This is also why most travelers avoided some areas of the galaxy entirely, like the Maw Cluster. Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy describes this region as a cluster of churning black holes that could confound navicomputers with lethal consequences. Even if it didn't include a hyperdrive failure, it wasn't worth the risk of traveling through. Nonetheless, the Maw plays a significant role in both Legends and canon continuities. It entered the canon continuity in Solo: A Star Wars Story, the official guide. It was occasionally used as a shortcut by daring smugglers, including Han Solo, when he made the Kessel Run in just 12 parsecs. Again, this was an insanely risky maneuver because most travelers through the Maw reported that their ships were slowly being pulled apart by the unusual gravitational forces and radiation. An extreme example of an encounter with an unusual spatial anomaly occurs in The Crystal Star, one of the weirdest Legends novels. Waru, a transdimensional being from a parallel universe, found himself in the regular Star Wars galaxy around 14 BBY. This occurred after one of the strangest space anomalies of them all, the crystallization of the star Chrysia. It triggered a large enough disturbance in the Force to transport a living being between two parallel universes. In the novel, a former apprentice of Darth Vader, the Ferrerio Hethrir, also played a key role. But theoretically, it's possible that if a hyperdrive failed in the wrong place, the passengers could find themselves in an entirely different universe. I should mention that most Legends fans consider The Crystal Star to be the worst Star Wars novel ever, and that Waru is a ridiculous creation. Nonetheless, it's still fascinating to consider, and it remains a part of Star Wars lore. Next, I want to discuss the impact of hyperdrive failures on other ship systems. The Millennium Falcon is a prime example because it's one of the ships we encounter most frequently in the Star Wars universe. Perhaps the most famous example of a hyperdrive failure is when Han, Leia, and Chewie are fleeing the Rebel base on Hoth. It simply cuts out and almost results in their capture. Han adapts quickly by turning off all systems except for life support. The Falcon escapes detection by clinging to the side of a Star Destroyer, which was actually insanely risky for a couple of reasons. First, there was a chance that another member of Darth Vader's strike force would spot them. But even more dangerous was the chance that the Star Destroyer would jump to hyperspace. If the Falcon detached from the Imperial ship in hyperspace without a working hyperdrive, we would have had a very different movie. Of course, that was never going to happen for narrative reasons, but it's theoretically feasible. Ultimately, Han escapes by flying into an asteroid field. This buys them the time to activate the backup hyperdrive and make the necessary repairs. Just by having a backup, it implies that hyperdrive failure is a real and present danger that ship captains must account for. We also see in canon that abusing a hyperdrive can have a severe impact on other ship systems. This happens in The Rise of Skywalker when Poe Dameron pushes his X-Wing to its limits by performing several rapid hyperspace jumps. His strategy put the starfighter under severe strain and instability. He was seconds from disaster, but his skill as a pilot meant that he managed to keep it together. Another example occurs in Star Wars Rebels with the Ghost. We see how the ship suffers hyperdrive reliability issues under stress during the Lothal supply raids. The ship's captain, Harrison Dula, is forced to make rapid calculations under fire to evade Imperial forces. These rushed jumps put extreme stress on the hyperdrive, the ship's hull, and other internal power systems. Energy must be split between the shields to survive enemy fire, the engines to maneuver while at sublight speed, and of course, the hyperdrive to escape this dangerous scenario. Although the Ghost doesn't suffer outright hyperdrive failure, the Ghost requires repairs and systems recalibration after these extreme events. Fleeing ships also have a crucial choice. If they want to charge their hyperdrive, they usually need to drop their shield power. This and the need to accurately calculate coordinates are the reasons why they often put distance between themselves and the enemy before jumping. Another unusual example happens on screen in The Mandalorian. Din Djarin crash lands the Razor Crest on an unnamed icy planet. The ship suffered extreme damage with a breached hull and failing systems. Ice spiders intervene to make the situation even worse. Eventually, Djarin and Grogu escape, but the ship is barely functional with critically degraded systems. Jumping to hyperspace with the ship in this condition is beyond risky because hyperdrive failure in Star Wars is rarely a single-point malfunction. Djarin and Grogu were very lucky to survive this encounter because it was borderline catastrophic. Starships are integrated systems with everything impacting each other. Perhaps the Falcon is the most extreme example of this because Han and Chewie are always patching it up and never quite sure where the problem is. Next, I want to discuss induced hyperdrive failure, which is a common military tactic in Star Wars. One of the most noteworthy examples is the Empire's use of the Interdictor-class heavy cruiser. Technically a member of the Star Destroyer family, his ship was one of their most effective weapons against escaping Rebel cells because it essentially stopped ships from jumping to hyperspace. These ships first gained popularity in the Legends universe, particularly in the Thrawn trilogy, and became a mainstay. Unsurprisingly, Dave Filoni recognized their brilliance and retconned them into the current canon, where Grand Admiral Thrawn used one during the Siege of Lothal. Each interdictor had 4 gravity well generators that prevented ships from jumping to hyperspace, or could even yank them from hyperspace. The latter was particularly dangerous for their victim, because it was like suddenly switching off the engine of a car without changing gears. It could even cause critical damage, leaving their target floating dead in space. According to the in-canon Star Wars Encyclopedia of Starfighters and Other Vehicles, an interdictor could carry up to 24 TIE fighters and boasted 20 quad lasers. One of the main differences between canon and Legends is that the former also used them as command ships despite their relatively small size. In Legends, we see that they were almost always part of a greater task force. The interdictor would power up its gravity well projectors to prevent the escaping party from fleeing, then the Imperials would use their starfighter squadrons and capital ship support to mop up or capture their victims. Remember, the Rebels used starfighter squadrons in a very different way to the Empire. Their X-Wings, A-Wings, and other fighters all had hyperdrives, unlike Imperial TIE fighters. This made them perfect for hit-and-run raids, but also susceptible to interdictors. Luke Skywalker fell foul of Grand Admiral Thrawn in an interdictor above Jomark in Dark Force Rising. They were also a regular antagonist for Rogue Squadron and Michael A. Stackpole's X-Wing series, however they were never used as command ships because they were instantly targets. Fleeing rebels knew that the only way to escape was to destroy or disable the interdictor, so it didn't make sense for the Imperials to put fleet commanders on board. Anyway, a ship of just over 2,000 crew members wasn't prestigious enough for the average Imperial admiral, even if interdictors were a very useful tool. The interdictor-class heavy cruiser eventually gave way to the interdictor-class Star Destroyer in canon. According to the Star Wars Encyclopedia, this was basically a revamped Imperial Star Destroyer with 4 gravity well projectors. They were more powerful than the old cruisers, which were susceptible to heavy enemy firepower. Star Wars Empire at War reveals that the gravity wells were slow to generate power and also affected other ships' systems. They slowed the ship's engines and affected the shields, so they were more vulnerable during intense firefights. This is another reason why they almost always operated as part of a strike group with at least one Imperial-class Star Destroyer and other support ships. In the Legends continuity, during the Yuuzhan Vong War, the Republic used a new model of interdictor known as the Immobilizer 418A against the Galactic invaders. Targeting hyperdrive engines isn't a new strategy. If we go all the way back to Knights of the Old Republic, the Sith also operated interdictor cruisers. These massive ships had an extremely intimidating profile and were comparable to the Imperial Star Destroyers of the Galactic Empire. Construction began in 3963 BBY with the Leviathan, the most notorious example. Like the later Imperial ships, these Sith interdictors had 4 gravity well projectors. Darth Malak used a fleet of these ships to blockade Taris to prevent Bastila Shan from fleeing the planet. Ultimately, his plan failed, so he devastated the planet's surface in retribution. Nonetheless, it's fascinating to see that this mode of warfare existed long before the Galactic Empire. Some fans may wonder why there's practically no mention of interdictor cruisers during the Clone Wars. This is primarily because the style of warfare was extremely different to the later Galactic Civil War. We see intense fleet-to-fleet combat throughout this conflict above Coruscant, Ryloth, and many other theaters. This was a war of attrition and brute force between 2 relentless machines with seemingly endless disposable clones and droids. Occasionally, the Jedi generals did use asymmetrical tactics, but usually there was no need for interdictors. Also, the technology wasn't as advanced at this point. In Star Wars On the Front Lines, we learn about the interdictor heavy cruiser's immediate predecessor, the Immobilizer 418 cruiser. In 14 BBY, Moff Tarkin used a brand new, state-of-the-art immobilizer as part of a task force to intercept the Carrion Spike, a corvette. However, the immobilizer malfunctioned and caused many of the task force's hyperdrives to malfunction, causing the ships to drop out of hyperspace. There really wasn't much development of this technology between the end of the Jedi Civil War and the rise of the Galactic Empire. The simple reason for this is that there was a much cheaper solution that could be included on almost every large ship. Ion cannons and tractor beams often did the same job. Ion cannons knock out the ship's power systems, so the crew can't perform a hyperspace jump, even if they wanted to. Then the tractor beam drags them on board the larger vessel like the Death Star snagged the Millennium Falcon in Episode 4. During the Clone Wars, General Grievous absolutely wasted one of the Separatists' most potentially devastating weapons. His ship, the Malevolence, was equipped with a uniquely powerful ion cannon that could disable entire Republic fleets. This would shut down their hyperdrive engines, shields, and weapons. However, the Republic eventually figured out his simple tactics and infiltrated it. What could have been a hyperspace-disrupting superweapon was used as a conventional weapon system. Ultimately, we know that Darth Sidious didn't care, because the Separatists were never meant to win the war. But it's still such a ridiculous misuse of a powerful weapon. Anyway, it's easy to see why preventing hyperdrive jumps is such a prevalent part of space combat in Star Wars.